Have you ever imagined what it would be like to receive a direct call from God? Have you considered abandoning everything, your home, family, friends, to follow an impossible promise? Well, my name is Abraham, and that is precisely my story. It all began in Ur, a thriving city along the banks of the Euphrates River in what we now call Iraq. I was 75 when most considered retirement and relaxation, but God had other plans for me. Imagine me, Abraham, as I was known then, a childless man. Married to a barren woman named Sarah, I was promised to become the father of a great nation. It sounded wild, but something inside me knew it was true. What was at stake? Merely the future of humanity, the redemption of the world, and the establishment of a people chosen by God. Very little. I lived a comfortable life in Ur, surrounded by family and friends, practicing my ancestors' religion, but I felt an emptiness, a restlessness I couldn't explain. That's when I first heard God's voice, clear and unmistakable. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12, 1-3. Imagine my family's shock when I announced I would depart. Abraham, have you lost your mind? They asked. Leave everything for a promise you can't see or touch? But deep down, I knew that voice was real. That call was irresistible. It was a challenging decision. I had to leave behind everything I knew, all my family ties, except for my father, Terah, who decided to accompany us to Haran, and my nephew Lot, who chose to come with us. The farewell was painful. Friends and family looked at us with concern and disbelief. Some thought I was having a late midlife crisis. Others believed I had lost my sanity. But Sarah, my faithful wife, stood by my side. Despite her fears and doubts, she had heard God's call and decided to support me on this crazy journey. Thus, with Sarah, Lot, my father Terah, and all our belongings, we set off into the unknown, leaving behind the safety of Ur and embarking on an adventure that would change not just our lives, but the destiny of all humanity. The journey was difficult. We crossed scorching deserts, faced hostile tribes, and battled the doubt that occasionally crept into our hearts. The path from Ur to Haran was long and arduous. The desert was relentless, with its suffocating heat during the day and bone-chilling cold at night. Our supplies were limited, and we trusted God to guide us to oases and water wells. There were moments when I questioned my decision. Had I heard correctly? Was it just my imagination? But with every step, every new horizon, I felt God's presence guiding me. We reached Haran, where my father Terah decided to settle. It was hard to leave him behind, but I knew my journey was incomplete. God called me to go further, to reach Canaan. It was in Haran that I received God's call again. With a heavy heart from parting with my father, but strengthened by the renewal of the promise, we immediately set off into the unknown. Finally, we arrived in Canaan, the promised land. It was a fertile and beautiful land, yet inhabited by various peoples. We set up our tents and established ourselves, always on the move, as nomads, guided by God's hand. In Shechem, God appeared to me again, saying, "To your offspring I will give this land." Genesis 12:7. There, I built an altar to the Lord, the first of many I would raise on my journey. It was an act of worship and a milestone, a physical reminder of God's promises. We continued our journey through southern Canaan, settling between Bethel and Ai. At each stop, I built an altar and called on the name of the Lord. It was my way of marking the territory, not with weapons or armies, but with worship and faith. Yet the trials were far from over. A severe famine struck the land, testing our faith and forcing us to make difficult decisions. The fields dried up, the livestock began to die, and the fear of hunger settled among us. Then I decided to seek refuge in Egypt, a land known for its abundance, thanks to the Nile River. It was not an easy decision, and as I soon discovered, it brought challenges and dangers. The journey to Egypt was tense. As we approached the border, a fear began to grow within me. My wife Sarah was a woman of great beauty, even at 65 years old. I feared that the Egyptians, seeing her beauty, would kill me to take her. In this moment of weakness, I made one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I asked Sarah to pretend to be my sister. "Say you are my sister so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you," I told her. Genesis 12:13. It was a moment of lack of faith, doubting God's protection. Sarah, in her loyalty, agreed to my plan. As I feared, we entered Egypt, and Sarah's beauty did not go unnoticed. The princes of the Pharaoh saw her and praised her before him. Before I realized it, Sarah was taken to the Pharaoh's palace. I was treated well because she received sheep, cattle, donkeys, servants, and camels. But at what cost? My beloved wife was in the Pharaoh's harem, and I felt powerless and guilty. It was nights of anguish and regret, praying fervently for God to intervene. And he did, but not in the way I expected. The Lord greatly plagued the Pharaoh and his house because of Sarah. Somehow the truth came out, and the Pharaoh confronted me. "What is this you have done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." Genesis 12:18-19. We were expelled from Egypt, narrowly escaping a much worse fate. This experience taught me a valuable lesson about trust and integrity. God did not need my schemes to protect us. He controlled everything. Back in Canaan, I faced another challenge, the separation from Lot. Our herds had grown so much during our stay in Egypt that the land could not support us. There were constant conflicts between my shepherds and those of Lot. I realized it was time for us to separate. I called Lot and said, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Genesis 13:8-9. It was an act of faith and generosity on my part. As the uncle and leader, I had the right to choose first, but I offered Lot the choice of land. He looked around and chose the fertile plains of the Jordan, which were well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, leaving me with the less desirable lands. But God had a plan. After this separation, he renewed his promise to me. "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. I will give you and your offspring all the land you see. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted." Genesis 13:14-16. At that moment, I understood that God rewards faith and trust we cannot imagine. But the challenges continued. Lot, my nephew, was captured in a war between local kings. When I heard about it, I gathered 318 trained men and set out on a rescue mission. With God's help, we managed to rescue Lot and all the goods that had been taken. On the return, I met Melchizedek, the king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. He brought out bread and wine and blessed me, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Genesis 14:19-20. In gratitude, I gave him 1/10 of everything. A dramatic image of Abraham leading his 318 trained men on a rescue mission through a rugged landscape, illustrating the urgency and bravery of the mission. The scene captures the moment of their return, as Melchizedek, a regal and serene figure, greets Abraham with bread and wine outside the city of Salem. This powerful encounter is depicted under a twilight sky, symbolizing the divine blessing and the peace following the rescue. At that moment, my faith was renewed. The Bible says that Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6. It was a crucial moment in my spiritual journey. I understood that faith is not just believing that God can do something, but trusting that He will do it, even when everything seems impossible. Then God made a covenant with me, confirmed by a profound ritual. He instructed me to bring a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. I cut the animals in half and arranged the halves opposite each other, but I did not cut the birds. At sunset, a deep sleep fell over me, and a great darkness filled me with fear. Then God spoke, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." Genesis 15:13-14. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with me, promising to give my descendants this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Genesis 15:18. But the wait continued, and human impatience began to speak louder. In anguish over the lack of a child, Sarah suggested a plan to change our lives forever. She said to me, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Genesis 16:2. I hesitated initially, but the idea of finally having an heir was tempting. I accepted Sarah's suggestion and took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, as a concubine. Soon Hagar became pregnant, and with that came new problems. The dynamics in our tent changed drastically. Hagar despised Sarah, who became resentful and blamed me for the situation. The atmosphere was tense, filled with jealousy and bitterness. Sarah treated Hagar harshly, so the enslaved person fled to the desert. It was a difficult time, full of regret and conflict. Trying to help God fulfill His promises through our means often leads to complications and pain. Yet God, in His mercy, did not abandon us. He took care of Hagar in the desert and sent her back, promising that her son would also be the father of a great nation. When I was 99, God appeared again, reaffirming His covenant and changing my name from Abram to Abraham, which means father of many nations. It was a solemn and powerful moment. God told me, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you." Genesis 17:4-6. He then promised that Sarah, as Sarai came to be called, at 90 years old, would give birth to a son. The promise was so incredible, so impossible in human eyes, that I couldn't help but laugh. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? I asked, half laughing, half doubting. I even suggested that God bless Ishmael, the son I already had with Hagar, but God was emphatic. "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." Genesis 17:21. God also blessed Ishmael, saying, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 17:20. It was hard to believe, but I learned over the years that with God, nothing is impossible. Not long after this encounter with God, I had an experience that would forever be etched in my memory. I was sitting at the entrance to my tent in the heat of the day when I saw 3 men. Moved by the customary hospitality in our land, I ran to meet them and invited them to rest and eat. I did not know then, but I was entertaining angels, one of them being the Lord himself. I quickly asked Sarah to prepare bread while I chose a tender and good calf to prepare. I served the visitors milk, curds, and meat, and stood by them while they ate. It was during this meal that the Lord made a statement that would change our lives. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Genesis 18:10. Sarah was behind the entrance of the tent, heard and laughed to herself just as I had done before. She thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Genesis 18:12. Knowing Sarah's thoughts, the Lord asked me why she had laughed and doubted. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At that moment I felt a mix of emotions, renewed hope, and a slight fear for the greatness of the God who visited us. The visitors stood up and looked towards Sodom, and I accompanied them to show them the way. It was then that the Lord decided to reveal his plans to me. He said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken about him." Genesis 18:17-19. I was deeply moved by this divine confidence and the responsibility it implied. The Lord then revealed that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah had grown, and their sin was grave. He was about to see if their wickedness was as great as the outcry that had reached him. At that moment, I felt a heavy weight in my heart. I thought of Lot, my nephew, who lived in Sodom. Would he be destroyed along with the wicked? It was then that I did something I never imagined I would do. I began to intercede with the Lord. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" I asked. "If there are 50 righteous within the city, will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it?" Genesis 18:23-24. To my surprise, the Lord responded that if he found 50 righteous, he would spare the entire city for their sake. Encouraged by his mercy, I continued negotiating, lowering the number to 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. The Lord agreed to spare the city each time if he found that number of righteous. I was amazed by God's patience and mercy, but also anxious about the fate of Sodom and my nephew Lot. The next morning, I got up early and went to where I had been in the presence of the Lord. I looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and saw dense smoke rising from the land, like the smoke of a furnace. My heart tightened, thinking of Lot and his family, but God in his mercy had remembered me and taken Lot out of the midst of the destruction when he overthrew the cities. After these events, Sarah and I moved to the Negev region, dwelling between Kadesh and Shur, and for a time we settled in Gerar. Again, overcome by fear, I made the same mistake I had made in Egypt years before. I said that Sarah was my sister, and Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for her. But God, in his faithfulness, protected Sarah and warned Abimelech in a dream. The king, fearing God, did not touch Sarah and reproached me for my lie. I was ashamed, but also grateful for divine protection. This episode made me reflect on how I could still fall into old patterns of fear and lack of faith, even after so many years of walking with God. I learned that spiritual growth is a continuous process, and we must always be vigilant against our weaknesses. Abimelech and I eventually made a covenant at Beersheba, where I planted a tamarisk tree and called on the name of the Lord. We swore honesty to each other, bringing peace and security to our lands. Genesis 21:22-34. It was a time of reflection on how covenants made in the name of God can bring stability and prosperity. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. As the Lord had promised, Sarah conceived and bore a son in my old age at the appointed time set by God. I named my son Isaac, which means laughter, for as Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Genesis 21:6. The joy we felt was indescribable. Every laugh from Isaac reminded us of the miracle God had performed in our lives. On the 8th day, I circumcised Isaac as God had commanded, sealing the covenant. I was 100 years old when Isaac was born, and Sarah was 90. We were elderly parents of a baby, which caused astonishment and admiration in everyone who heard our story. The birth of Isaac was proof that God fulfilled his promises, no matter how impossible they may seem to human eyes. However, Isaac's arrival brought new challenges. I held a great feast to celebrate the day Isaac was weaned. During the feast, Sarah saw Ishmael, the son I had with Hagar, mocking. This enraged her, and she said to me, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Genesis 21:10. Deeply distressed. Ishmael was my son. I loved him. How could I send him away? But God spoke to me, saying not to be distressed and to do as Sarah had asked, for it was through Isaac that my offspring would be named. He assured me he would also make a nation of Ishmael because he was my son. With a heavy heart but trusting in God, I got up early in the morning, gave bread and a skin of water to Hagar, and sent them away. Some years passed and Isaac grew strong and healthy. Our life finally seemed to have a happy balance, but God had one last terrible test for my faith. One night, I heard the voice of God calling me. "Abraham," I answered, "Here I am." And then came the command that chilled my heart. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Genesis 22:2. I was stunned. How could God ask something like this? Isaac was the son of the promise, the one through whom God had promised to establish his covenant. How could I sacrifice him? I spent the night awake, wrestling with this order, but ultimately I decided to trust. With a broken heart, I got up at dawn, saddled my donkey, took 2 of my servants and Isaac, and set out for the place God had indicated. The journey to Moriah was the longest and most painful of my life. For 3 days we traveled, and each step was agony. Isaac, innocent, had no idea what was to come. On the 3rd day, I saw the place from afar. I left the servants behind and went on with Isaac alone. He carried the wood for the burnt offering, while I carried the fire and the knife. Along the way, Isaac asked me, "Father, here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Genesis 22:7. His innocent question nearly broke me. With a heavy heart, I replied, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Genesis 22:8. We reached the place God had indicated. I built an altar, arranged the wood, tied up Isaac, and laid him on the altar. Then I reached out and took the knife to sacrifice my son. It was the hardest moment of my life. My heart screamed, but my faith propelled me to obey. At the last moment, when the knife was raised, I heard a shout from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" I responded quickly, "Here I am." And then came the command that brought relief to my tormented heart. Do not lay a hand on the boy, do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Genesis 22:11-12. At that moment, I saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket behind me. I took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of my son. I named that place, "The Lord Will Provide," for, as we say to this day, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Genesis 22:14. That day, I learned the true meaning of trusting God completely, even when His commands seem incomprehensible. The angel of the Lord called to me a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice." Genesis 22:16-18. This experience, though terrifying, strengthened my faith in ways I could never have imagined. I understood that God did not desire the sacrifice of Isaac, but wanted to see how far my obedience and trust in him would go. Life continued after this momentous event. Sarah lived to be 127 years old, and her death was a hard blow for me. I had to negotiate the purchase of land for her burial. The Cave of Machpelah was my first property in the Promised Land, a tangible reminder that God's promises are fulfilled, even if we do not see their complete realization in our earthly life. After mourning for Sarah, my attention turned to finding a wife for Isaac. I did not want him to marry one of the Canaanite women, so I sent my oldest servant back to my homeland to find a wife among my relatives. Through a series of providential events, the servant finds Rebekah, who becomes Isaac's wife. In my later years, I remarried to a woman named Keturah and had more children, but Isaac remained my main heir, to whom I gave all my possessions. I lived to be 175 years old, a long and full life, and was gathered to my people. Isaac and Ishmael buried me in the cave of Machpelah alongside Sarah. My story did not end with my death. Through Isaac and later Jacob, the people of Israel were born. My descendants multiplied like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, just as God had promised. They faced many trials, slavery in Egypt, wandering in the desert, wars and exiles. But through it all, God's promise remained. The land promised to me became the home of my descendants, fulfilling the word of the Lord. As the generations after me unfolded, the impact of my decisions and the strength of my faith were tested and proven through my descendants. The stories of Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel all bear the marks of the covenant first established with me. Each story, from Joseph's trials in Egypt to the eventual Exodus under Moses, echoes the promises made to me under the stars. Throughout biblical history, my example of unwavering faith and obedience under trial has served as a beacon for many. Prophets, kings, and ordinary people have looked to my story for guidance and inspiration, drawing strength from my trust in God's promises, no matter how impossible they seemed. In modern times, my faith journey resonates with people of various faiths around the world. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all see me as a patriarch, a model of faithfulness to God. This shared reverence has made my story a bridge between cultures and religions, promoting dialogue and understanding despite deep differences. As I reflect upon the legacy I have left behind, I am humbled by the role I played in God's plan. From a solitary figure called to leave everything behind, to becoming a cornerstone of faith for billions, my story is less about my own strength and more about the power of divine promise and guidance. Even today, as new challenges arise for the faithful, my story offers a timeless reminder: the importance of trust and obedience to God, the significance of making hard decisions with faith, and the ultimate truth that God's promises are always fulfilled, though often in ways we cannot foresee. As societies evolve and new ethical dilemmas arise, my life's decisions are often revisited for their moral implications. My willingness to sacrifice Isaac, for instance, is debated among philosophers and theologians as a discussion of faith versus ethics. This story challenges individuals to consider the balance between divine command and moral responsibility. In areas of conflict resolution and peace studies, my covenant with Abimelech serves as an example of how early agreements can establish lasting peace among different groups. This narrative is used to teach the importance of negotiation, trust building, and the mutual recognition of rights in peace processes. My journey also resonates in discussions about migration and identity. As a migrant who left his homeland to establish a new life based on a divine promise, my experiences provide insight into the challenges faced by modern migrants and refugees. My story offers a narrative of hope and resilience to those displaced by war, famine, and persecution. My legacy is not just limited to religious teachings. It extends into family dynamics and parenting. The complex relationships I had with Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, and Ishmael continue to be analyzed for insights into family psychology, showing how faith and family roles intersect and influence one another. Finally, as humanity faces existential threats and environmental crises, my role as a steward of the land and my interactions with it prompt discussions on sustainable living and environmental stewardship. My life encourages today's societies to reflect on how we use and care for the Earth's resources, reminding us of our responsibilities to future generations. My story did not end with my death. Through Isaac and later Jacob, the people of Israel were born. My descendants multiplied like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, just as God had promised. They faced many trials: slavery in Egypt, wandering in the desert, wars and exiles. But through it all, God's promise remained. The land promised to me became the home of my descendants, fulfilling the word of the Lord. But the promise went beyond a nation and a land. God had said that through me, all the families of the earth would be blessed. This blessing extended far beyond what I could have imagined in my earthly life. Centuries after my death, Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, was born from my lineage. Through him, the blessing promised to me reached all nations of the earth, not just the physical descendants of Isaac and Jacob, but all those who share the same faith I had. Today, I am called the Father of Faith, not only by Jews, but also by Christians and Muslims around the world. My faith journey has become an example for billions of people, showing that trusting in God, even when His promises seem impossible, leads to blessings that surpass our understanding. What did I learn on my journey? Faith is not the absence of doubts, but the courage to trust, even when we do not understand. There were times when I doubted, times when I tried to help God fulfill His promises through my means. But I learned that God's promises are certain, even when they seem impossible. His faithfulness depends not on our perfection, but on His unchanging grace and love. I also learned that our obedience, as difficult as it may be, opens doors to blessings that transcend generations. When God asked me to leave my homeland, I could not imagine the impact of that decision. When He asked me to sacrifice Isaac, I could not see how that could align with His promises. But with each step of obedience, God was weaving a story much larger than I could comprehend. My life was marked by highs and lows, moments of great faith and human weakness. I made mistakes, such as when I lied about Sarah being my sister, or when I doubted God's promise and had a child with Hagar. But through it all, God remained faithful. He did not give up on me when I faltered, but continued to shape me, teaching me to trust Him more deeply. One of the most important lessons I learned was about the character of God. He is not a distant and indifferent being, but a personal God who deeply cares for his children. He hears our prayers, sympathizes with our weaknesses, and is willing to guide us step by step on our faith journey. My experience of interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah showed me the merciful heart of God and his willingness to listen to the pleas of his people. Another crucial lesson was about God's purpose for our lives. He calls us not just for our blessing, but to be a channel of his blessing to others. The promise I received was not just for me or my direct descendants, but for all nations of the earth. This taught me to look beyond myself to see the bigger picture of God's plan for humanity. The journey of faith, as I learned, is not a straight line. It is filled with twists, steep climbs, and deep valleys. There are moments of exuberant joy, like when Isaac was born, and moments of deep sadness, like when I had to send Ishmael away. There are times of clear divine direction and times of silent waiting. But in every stage of this journey, God is present, working in and through us. One of the hardest lessons I learned was about trust and surrender. God's request to sacrifice Isaac was the supreme test of my faith. It was a moment when I had to trust God beyond any human understanding. This experience taught me that God sometimes asks us to surrender what we love most, not because he wants to deprive us, but because he wants us to trust him. In the end, God always provides, even if in ways we cannot initially predict or understand. My story is a testimony that God chooses the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. I was an old man, my wife was barren, and yet we became the progenitors of nations. I was a nomad without land, yet I became the heir to an entire country. I was a man with flaws and weaknesses, and yet God used me to bless all the nations of the earth. This shows that the power is not in us, but in God, who works through us. God's covenant with me was not based on my perfection or merit, but on his grace and faithfulness. This covenant extended far beyond my life, shaping the history of Israel and, through Jesus Christ, reaching all nations of the earth. It is a covenant that remains alive today, offering hope and redemption to all who believe. And you, listening to my story now, what call is God making in your life? What promises seem impossible to fulfill? Remember, the same God who called me, who fulfilled his promises to me against all odds, is the God who is calling you today. He has not changed. His faithfulness remains. His ability to transform lives and accomplish the impossible remains the same. You may feel like I often felt inadequate, weak, and full of doubts. Know that God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. He does not seek perfection, but willingness to trust, to obey, to take a step of faith, even when the path ahead is not clear. My story is not just about me. It is about a God who cares, calls, promises, and fulfills. It is about a God who uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. It is about a God who invites us to be part of his grand redemption narrative. So what will you do with your calling? Will you take the step of faith, even without seeing the journey's end? Will you trust even when everything seems impossible? The adventure is waiting. The God who called me is calling you. The question is, are you ready to answer? We have reached the end of our video, and I hope you like it. If you're looking for inspiration, knowledge, and spiritual connection, don't let this opportunity pass you by. Subscribe to our channel now, leave your like and comment to strengthen our community. And if you want to help us continue sharing religious stories that touch hearts, become a channel member. Together we can make a difference and strengthen our spiritual journey. We're counting on you. We've left the link in the description of this video so you can become a member today. Continue watching videos about the history of the Bible. I will leave 2 recommendations here on the screen. God bless you. We will get to the next video.